World War II stories often focus on epic battles, but some moments reveal courage in ways that words can scarcely capture. Private First Class Harold Agerholm's daring actions on Saipan exemplify this, as he repeatedly risked his life to rescue wounded comrades under relentless enemy fire. The screaming started at 4:45 in the morning. Private First Class Harold Christ Agerholm had been awake for hours, crouched in his position with the headquarters and service battery. At 19 years old, the young man from Racine, Wisconsin had already survived the brutal beaches of Beechey Island during the Tarawa campaign. He had seen things that would have broken most men, but nothing had prepared him for what was coming across the darkened fields. The sound was inhuman. Thousands of voices screaming their battle cry rolled across the volcanic landscape like thunder. Harold froze as the realization hit him. He had heard about banzai charges from veterans who had faced them on other islands. But this was different. This was massive. Through the pre-dawn darkness he could see them coming. Not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands. Some wore full uniforms, others little more than loincloths. Many already wounded and limping, yet the Japanese soldiers still pressed forward. Some carried rifles. Others wielded nothing but sharpened bamboo sticks or bayonets lashed to poles. They came in waves, like a human tsunami crashing against the American positions held by the Army's 105th Infantry Regiment. Lieutenant General Yoshitsu Saito had given his final order. With nowhere left to retreat on the island, he had assembled every fighting man. More than 4,000 soldiers for one last, suicidal assault. They would die for the Emperor. The first wave hit the seam between the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry like a hammer blow. Within minutes, American positions were being overrun. Harold watched the chaos unfold from his artillery position. Explosions lit up the sky. Tracers arced through the darkness in both directions. The crackle of small arms fire was constant now, building to a crescendo. Through the smoke and confusion, he could see soldiers falling back, could hear the screams of wounded men crying out in pain and terror. The neighboring artillery battalion had been overrun. Men were dying. Men who needed help. Harold had joined the Marine Corps Reserve in July 1942, fresh out of high school, working as a multigraph operator. He was not a corpsman. He was not a medic. He was an artilleryman, assigned to headquarters battery. But looking at the carnage ahead, Harold knew what he had to do. Something inside him, a sense of duty that transcended orders, transcended job descriptions, transcended even the powerful instinct for self-preservation. He stood up and volunteered to help evacuate the wounded. His fellow Marines tried to stop him. The fire was too heavy. It was suicide. The expressions on their faces told him they thought he would never come back. But Harold was already moving, his mind made up. Then he saw it, an abandoned ambulance jeep, sitting maybe 50 yards away in the open. Harold ran for it. Bullets snapped through the air around him, some so close he could hear their supersonic crack. A mortar round exploded to his left, showering him with dirt and volcanic rock fragments that stung his exposed skin. He did not slow down. He reached the jeep, threw himself into the driver's seat, and fired up the engine. The vehicle lurched forward, and Harold aimed it straight toward the hell unfolding in front of him. The scene that met Harold when he reached the forward positions defied description. Bodies lay everywhere, American and Japanese, living and dead intermingled in grotesque tableaus that seemed lifted from some medieval painting. Wounded soldiers called out for help, their voices barely audible over the constant roar of battle. Japanese attackers still poured through gaps in the line, engaging in desperate hand-to-hand combat with American troops. Harold skidded the jeep to a stop behind a partially destroyed position. Two soldiers lay nearby, one clutching his stomach where dark blood seeped between his fingers, the other shot through the leg. Both were conscious but unable to move on their own. Both looked at him with eyes that held equal parts hope and disbelief. Harold jumped from the jeep and ran to the first man. Blood poured from the stomach wound, dark and ominous. Harold grabbed him under the arms and dragged him toward the jeep, ignoring the sharp crack of rifle fire that kicked up dirt inches from his feet. His muscles strained with the dead weight. The wounded man groaned, but did not scream. A Japanese soldier emerged from behind a destroyed gun emplacement, advancing toward him with deadly intent. Harold eased the wounded man down as carefully as he could, picked up his rifle, and fired 2 quick shots. The enemy soldier went down. Harold immediately went back to the casualty, lifting him into the jeep with strength born of pure adrenaline and desperation. The second man was easier, conscious enough to help himself with Harold's support. Harold practically lifted him into the back of the jeep, jumped behind the wheel, and then floored the accelerator, racing back toward the aid station through a gauntlet of enemy fire. Bullets punched through the canvas cover. One took off the side mirror. Another punctured the fuel tank, causing gasoline to stream out behind them. The corpsmen at the aid station looked shocked when Harold's jeep roared up with its cargo of wounded men. They rushed forward to pull the casualties from the vehicle, working with practiced efficiency, even as explosions continued to rock the ground. Blood covered the jeep's seats and floor. The corpsman glanced at Harold, taking in his youth, his determination. Harold did not wait for their assessment. He turned the jeep around and drove straight back into the maelstrom. For the next 3 hours, Private First Class Harold Agerholm became a one-man rescue operation. He made trip after trip into the killing zone, each time loading wounded Marines and soldiers into his ambulance jeep. Each time driving them back through hellish fire to the relative safety of the aid stations. The jeep's fuel leak worsened with each journey, but Harold kept going. When that jeep finally gave out, stranded with an empty tank in a relatively quiet area, Harold found another abandoned vehicle and continued. The sun rose over Saipan, revealing the full horror of the battlefield. Bodies lay in heaps where the banzai charge had crashed against American positions. Some areas were so thick with Japanese dead that Harold had to carefully maneuver around them, wheels sometimes rolling over corpses. Artillery fire had cratered the landscape, turning it into a moonscape of smoking holes and shattered earth. The smell was overwhelming. Cordite, blood, torn earth, and death. Harold did not let himself think about the danger. If he thought about it, really thought about what he was doing, he might freeze up. So he focused on the mechanics of the task. Find the wounded, load them carefully but quickly. Drive, unload, repeat. It became a rhythm, a terrible kind of dance with death. Some of the men he rescued were conscious, their faces twisted in pain as the jeep bounced over rough terrain. Others were unconscious or delirious with blood loss, their bodies limp and pale. Harold handled all of them with care, trying to minimize their suffering even as speed was essential. Every second counted. Every moment delayed was a moment closer to death for men bleeding out on the battlefield. On one trip, he had lost count of which number, Harold found a corporal with both legs shattered by a mortar blast. The man had dragged himself behind a demolished machine gun nest, leaving a trail of blood in the dirt like some wounded animal seeking shelter. His face was gray with shock, his breathing rapid and shallow. Harold could see the man was fading fast. Harold worked quickly, fashioning a tourniquet from a belt, lifting the corporal, a man who outweighed him by 30 pounds. Another Marine, this one shot through the shoulder, limped over and climbed in without being told. The wounded helped the wounded when they could. A Japanese sniper's bullet ricocheted off a rock next to Harold's head, spraying his face with stone chips that drew blood from a dozen tiny cuts. He barely flinched. He had moved beyond fear into some other state of consciousness, where only the mission mattered. Harold kept driving. Even as the Jeep's engine whined in protest, pushed to its limits. More bullets found the vehicle. One punctured the radiator, causing steam to hiss from under the hood. Another shattered the windshield. Harold forced the Jeep forward, squinting through the spider-webbed glass. Steering with one hand, the other arm wrapped around the wounded man to keep him from tumbling out. A pattern emerged as the morning wore on. Harold would arrive at the aid station with a load of wounded. While corpsmen unloaded them, he would grab whatever supplies he could: water, bandages, morphine, sirette. Then he would head back out, sometimes receiving information about where casualties had been spotted. Sometimes just driving toward wherever the fighting sounded heaviest. The battlefield was chaos given form. The Japanese banzai charge had been blunted but not stopped. Pockets of enemy soldiers fought with fanatical determination, holed up in destroyed buildings and shell craters. American forces were conducting a slow, brutal clearing operation, rooting out resistance position by position. Every yard was contested. Every structure potentially held death. Harold learned to read the battlefield, to understand where wounded would likely be found. He learned to anticipate danger, to recognize the sound of incoming mortars, to spot the glint of enemy rifles in the morning sun. But knowing danger was coming and being able to avoid it were two different things. Luck played as much a role as skill. On one rescue run, he found 3 wounded men pinned down by a Japanese machine gun position. They were trapped in a shallow crater, unable to move without drawing fire. Harold tried to approach them from an angle, using destroyed vehicles and rubble for cover. He managed to get within 20 yards before the machine gun spotted him and opened fire. Bullets stitched across the ground in front of the Jeep, forcing him to stop. Harold sat in the driver's seat, thinking and calculating. He couldn't reach the men directly, but he could create a distraction. He revved the engine, drew the machine gun's attention, then suddenly accelerated forward at an angle. The Japanese gunner tracked him, firing a long burst that punched holes through the Jeep's body. But in those few seconds, one of the wounded men, showing remarkable courage and endurance, dragged his comrades backward out of the crater. Gaining just enough distance to be shielded by a rise in the ground. Harold circled back, picked up the 3 men, and transported them to safety. All 3 survived. By mid-morning, Harold had rescued dozens of men. The exact number would never be known. The chaos of battle made precise record-keeping impossible. Some reports would later suggest 45 casualties evacuated. What mattered was that dozens of men who would have died on that field lived because a 19-year-old kid from Wisconsin refused to let them die alone. But the cost was mounting. Harold himself had been wounded multiple times by shrapnel and rock fragments. Blood seeped from cuts on his face, arms, and legs. His uniform was torn and burned in places where explosions had come too close. He felt the adrenaline draining from his system, exhaustion rising in its place, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that made every movement an effort. The Jeep was barely functional. The windshield was gone. The canvas top hung in tatters. Bullet holes perforated every panel. The engine made ominous rattling sounds, and the steering pulled hard to the left. But it still ran, and as long as it ran, Harold would use it. He made another trip into the forward area, this time to retrieve a lieutenant who had been shot through the chest. The officer was unconscious, his breathing labored and wet-sounding. Harold knew the signs. A lung had been punctured. Time was critical. He loaded the lieutenant with exceptional care, trying not to jostle him, knowing that any rough handling could cause additional internal damage. Harold delivered the wounded lieutenant to the corpsman, who rushed him immediately into surgery. The young private stood beside his battered Jeep, swaying slightly on his feet. Medical personnel urged him to rest, to let someone else take over. Other Marines had joined the evacuation effort, inspired by his example. He had done more than enough. He had done more than could be expected of any man. But Harold saw wounded men still out there. He could hear them calling for help, their voices carrying across the battlefield. How could he rest while brothers were dying? The thought was incomprehensible to him. His sense of duty, that core of steel that had driven him forward all morning, would not let him stop. He climbed back into the Jeep one more time. The battlefield had changed over the past hours. The massive bonsai charge had been broken. But isolated groups of Japanese soldiers continued fighting. The area was still deadly, still swept by rifle and machine gun fire, still subject to random mortar barrages. Bodies lay everywhere, testimony to the morning's slaughter. The smell had grown worse in the rising heat. Harold drove carefully through the destruction, scanning for wounded. He spotted a small group of Marines waving from behind a destroyed tank. 3 men, all wounded, all needing evacuation. Harold turned the Jeep toward them, accelerating across open ground. He never heard the shell that killed him. The Japanese mortar rounds struck with devastating precision. One moment Harold was driving, focused on reaching the wounded men. The next moment, there was fire and thunder and oblivion. The explosion killed him instantly, along with the 4 wounded Marines he was carrying. The Jeep, that faithful vehicle that had carried so many to safety, was destroyed utterly, reduced to twisted, burning metal. Other Marines witnessed the explosion from a distance. They saw the fireball, saw the debris scattered across the battlefield. Knew immediately that no one could have survived. Some of them stopped what they were doing, stunned by the loss. Others felt tears on their faces, mixing with the dirt and blood already there. That terrible morning, Private First Class Harold Christ Agerholm died as he had lived, serving his fellow Marines and placing their lives before his own. In the days and weeks that followed, as American forces completed the conquest of Saipan at a cost of over 3,000 dead and 10,000 wounded, stories of Harold's heroism spread through the ranks. The men he had saved told others about the young Marine who had repeatedly driven into hell itself to pull them out. Officers compiled reports. Witnesses gave statements. A recommendation for the Medal of Honor was submitted. On December 8, 1945, more than a year after his death, Private First Class Harold Christ Agerholm was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation praised his exceptional valor and selfless dedication in rescuing wounded men under heavy enemy fire during the Japanese counterattack on Saipan. The official citation would describe how Harold had made repeated trips into areas swept by enemy fire to evacuate casualties. How he had continued his rescue efforts despite increasing danger and his own mounting exhaustion. How he had ultimately given his life while attempting to save others. One young Marine made the choice to save lives rather than simply survive. He made that choice again and again, trip after trip, rescue after rescue, until the battlefield claimed him. Private First Class Harold Christ Agerholm, United States Marine Corps, gave the last full measure of devotion to his brothers in arms. His story endures as a testament to the courage, selflessness, and sacrifice that defined a generation of Americans. The field where he died is quiet now, the scars of battle long since healed over. But his name lives on, in the citation of his Medal of Honor, in the records of the 10th Marines, in the memories passed down through the families of the men he saved, and in the proud tradition of the Marine Corps that continues to honor those who embody its values of honor, courage, and commitment. Harold Agerholm was 19 years old when he died. He had lived less than 2 decades, but in his final hours, he demonstrated a nobility of spirit that many do not achieve in a lifetime. That is the measure of the man. Thank you for watching and spending these moments with us. If you'd like to hear more remarkable World War II stories, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next episode.